The year was 1878, and the land held its breath. Out on the vast, unforgiving plains of the territory, winter was not so much a season as it was a predator, stalking the edges of the year, waiting to claim the weak. For Ezra Blackwood, the quiet of his homestead was a sound louder than any storm. It was the sound of absence, a hollow echo in the small cabin where laughter once lived. Grief was a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders as he mended a fence that bordered nothing but more emptiness, the wind his only companion, whispering of things lost. His wife, Clara, and their little boy, Henry, had been taken by the fever 2 years prior. They lay now under 2 small mounds of earth marked by simple wooden crosses, a permanent testament to the fragility of life in a place that demanded so much strength. Ezra had been a man of gentle smiles and easy words then. Now, his face was a mask carved from hardship, his mouth a grim line, his eyes holding the flat, distant look of a man who had seen too much of the world's finality. He worked from before the sun rose until long after it bled out across the horizon, the physical exhaustion a welcome distraction from the ache that resided deep in his bones. His life had become a stark, monotonous routine. Tend the few scrawny cattle that survived the dry summer, chop wood, check his traps, and sit in the crushing silence of his home. The boy's small wooden horse, still sitting on the mantelpiece, a sentinel of sorrow. One afternoon, as a sky the color of a fresh bruise promised an early frost, Ezra was riding the southern edge of his property. He was checking the weak points in a barbed wire fence, a futile effort against a land that seemed determined to reclaim everything man made. His horse, a stoic gray gelding named Boulder, stopped short, ears twitching. Ezra followed the animal's gaze and saw a shape crumpled near the dried-up creek bed. At first, he thought it was a deer, felled by a coyote. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a human form. It was a woman, and from her buckskin dress and the raven-black hair fanned out in the dust, he knew she was Cheyenne. A knot of caution tightened in his gut. The tension between settlers and the tribes was a constant, simmering threat, a fire banked but never extinguished. A lone homesteader was vulnerable, and common sense screamed at him to turn his horse and ride away, to pretend he had seen nothing. Trouble was a guest he could not afford to entertain. He was a man whittled down to the bare essentials of survival. He had nothing left to give, and certainly nothing to risk. He stayed in the saddle, watching her for a long moment. She did not move. Her stillness was profound, the kind that bordered on the edge of life itself. He could see the sharp angle of her shoulder blades through the thin material of her dress, the way the dust clung to her cracked lips. She was starving. He could see it from 20 paces away. It was a look he knew, a desperation that stripped away everything but the raw need to draw one more breath. He thought of Clara in her final days, the way her strength had just evaporated. With a curse that was more a prayer of resignation, he dismounted. The leather of his saddle groaned in protest. He approached slowly, his hands held out and open, a gesture he hoped would be understood if she were conscious. She did not stir. Kneeling beside her, he saw the faint, fluttery pulse in the hollow of her throat. Her skin was hot and dry to the touch. Dehydration, starvation, exhaustion, a lethal trinity on the plains. Her face, though smudged with dirt and etched with suffering, held a fierce pride in its bone structure. She was young, perhaps no older than 20. He looked back toward his cabin, a small speck of smoke rising from its chimney. Then he looked at her. The world told him she was an enemy, a danger, a problem to be avoided. But what he saw was simply a human being at the very end of her tether, the part of him that he thought had died with his family, the part that knew compassion, stirred painfully in his chest. He couldn't leave her. Leaving her would be an act of cruelty that would haunt his already crowded ghosts. With a grunt of effort, he gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of flour, a fragile collection of bones. He carried her to his horse, managed to settle her in front of him in the saddle, and began the slow walk back to the cabin, her head lolling against his chest. The silence he had known for 2 years had been broken, and he had no idea if he had just invited salvation or ruin into his home. He laid her gently on the cot in the corner of the single room, the one he normally used for storing gear. He brought a dipper of water first, lifting her head and letting the cool liquid trickle past her lips. She coughed, and her eyes fluttered open. They were dark and deep, and for a moment they were filled with a wild, cornered animal fear. She tried to push herself up, a flash of defiance in her weakness. "Easy," Ezra said, his voice rough from disuse. He held up his hands again. "Water, just water." She stared at him, her gaze traveling from his worn face to the stark, clean interior of the cabin, finally resting on the small wooden horse on the mantel. A flicker of something unreadable passed through her eyes before they closed again, her brief surge of strength depleted. She drank the next dipper of water more readily, a silent acknowledgement of her own desperate need. Ezra knew she needed more than water. She needed food. He looked at his own meager supplies. He had a small sack of cornmeal, half a slab of salted bacon, and one single solitary loaf of bread he had baked 2 days ago. It was meant to last him until his trip into the settlement of Prairie Dog Creek, a journey he wouldn't make for another week at least. That loaf of bread was precious. It was sustenance. It was survival. He looked at the woman on his cot, at the hollows in her cheeks. He remembered Clara wasting away and the terrible feeling of helplessness as he had watched her fade. He could not cure the fever, but this he could do something about. He walked to the shelf, took down the loaf of bread and sliced a thick piece from it. He put it on a tin plate and brought it to her. Her eyes opened again as he approached. They were wary, suspicious. He set the plate down beside her on the floor, then retreated to the other side of the room, giving her space. He sat at his small table and watched. For a long time she just looked at the bread, as if it might be a trick. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, she reached for it. She broke off a tiny piece and ate it, chewing with a profound slowness, as if reacquainting her body with the very idea of food. She ate half the slice, then carefully wrapped the rest in a corner of her tunic and lay back, her breathing already seeming a little less shallow. She had saved the rest. The act spoke of a life lived in uncertainty, of a discipline born from hardship. It was a mirror of his own careful rationing, and in that small, silent gesture, a thread of understanding was spun between them in the quiet cabin. For the next 2 days they existed in a state of watchful truce. He offered her food. She accepted it with a quiet dignity that never wavered. He never pressed her for information, and she offered none. They communicated through gestures. He would point to the water bucket. She would nod. She would point to the healing cut on her leg. He would bring her a clean rag and some salve. He gave her space, letting her sleep in the cabin while he took his bedroll to the barn, the scent of hay and horse a familiar comfort. He found himself listening for her movements, for the sound of her breathing. The silence of the cabin was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with a quiet presence, a life he had chosen to protect. On the 3rd morning, he woke in the barn to find her standing in the doorway. She had washed her face and hair, and though still thin, a measure of strength had returned to her. She wore one of Clara's old shawls he had left out for her, and it hung loosely on her frame. She looked at him, her dark eyes clear and direct. Then she pointed to herself and spoke one word. "Vivina." Ezra nodded, understanding. "Ezra," he replied, pointing to his own chest. Vivina gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Then she pointed east, toward the rising sun. Her meaning was clear. She was leaving. He felt a strange pang of something. Not disappointment exactly. More like a return to the inevitable quiet he had known before. He walked with her to the edge of his property, the same spot where he had found her. The sun was casting long shadows across the plains. She stopped and turned to him. She reached into a small pouch at her waist that he hadn't noticed before and pulled out a single eagle feather, its tip dyed a vibrant red. She held it out to him. It was a powerful gift, he knew that much. A symbol of courage, of honor. He hesitated, feeling unworthy. He had only given her a piece of bread. She pressed it into his hand, her fingers briefly brushing his. Her touch was warm, her eyes held his for a long moment, and in their depths he saw a promise and a gratitude so profound it needed no words. Then, without a backward glance, she turned and began walking east, a small, resilient figure swallowed by the immense landscape. Ezra stood there for a long time, the feather clutched in his hand, watching until she was gone. Then he turned and walked back to his silent cabin, the quiet somehow heavier than before. The seasons turned with the unforgiving rhythm of the prairie. Autumn's brief, golden reprieve gave way to the iron-gray fist of winter. The wind grew teeth, howling around the corners of the cabin like a grieving soul. Ezra's already difficult existence became a desperate struggle. A blight had taken most of his meager corn crop, and an early, vicious cold snap had claimed 2 of his remaining cattle. He was more isolated than ever, the snows cutting him off from the distant settlement. His supplies dwindled at an alarming rate. He rationed his food with a miser's care, the pangs of hunger, a constant, gnawing companion. The cold was relentless, seeping through the chinks in the cabin walls that he constantly plugged with mud and grass. Some days he felt his resolve cracking, the profound loneliness threatening to consume him entirely. He spent his evenings staring into the fire, the eagle feather Vivina had given him tucked into the leather binding of an old book. It was a tangible reminder of a moment of connection in a life that had become devoid of it. Just before the deepest part of winter set in, he had been forced to make a trip to Prairie Dog Creek. The town was little more than a muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings, but it was the only source of supplies for 100 miles. It was there he had the misfortune of running into Arthur Callahan. Callahan was a man who had gotten rich on cattle and arrogance, buying up smaller homesteads from desperate men. He saw Ezra's gaunt face and worn-out clothes and smelled opportunity. Blackwood, Callahan had boomed, his voice slick with false sympathy as he blocked Ezra's path outside the general store. Heard you had a rough season. That land of yours is too much for one man, especially a man with your luck. Ezra just stared at him, his face impassive. It's my land, Callahan. For now, Callahan sneered, dropping the pretense. Winter's coming. A bad one, they say. It'll finish you. Sell to me now, and you can walk away with something in your pocket. Wait, and all I'll have to do is file a claim on your abandoned plot come spring. I'm not abandoning it, Ezra said, his voice low and cold. Callahan laughed, a harsh, grating sound. We'll see. Pride don't fill a man's belly or keep him warm. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Ezra's boots. When you're freezing to death, remember my offer. Now, with a blizzard raging outside, burying his world in a sea of white, Callahan's words echoed in his mind. The storm had lasted for 3 days without a break. The wind shrieked, and the snow piled in drifts that reached the cabin's windowsills. His woodpile was nearly gone, his food reduced to a handful of dried beans and a sliver of bacon. His last cow, a bony creature he called Hope, lay dying in the barn, her breaths coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Ezra sat by the dying fire, the cold a living thing that crawled under his skin and settled in his marrow. He was too weak from hunger to bring in the cow's carcass for meat, even if he had the strength to butcher it. It was over. Callahan had been right. He had fought the land, fought the grief, fought the loneliness, and he had lost. He felt a strange sense of calm settle over him, the kind that comes when all struggle ceases. He thought of Clara and Henry, and for the first time in a long while, the memory brought not a sharp pain, but a dull, weary peace. Perhaps he would see them soon. He closed his eyes, the eagle feather clutched in his hand, and resigned himself to the encroaching cold. It was a sound that pulled him back from the precipice, a sound that did not belong in the blizzard's symphony of chaos. It was the rhythmic thud of horses' hooves, muffled by the deep snow. Ezra's eyes snapped open. He thought his mind was playing tricks on him, conjuring phantoms in his final moments. But the sound grew louder, closer. He struggled to his feet, his joints screaming in protest, and peered through a small, ice-caked pane of the window. Through the swirling vortex of white, he saw them, figures on horseback, moving like ghosts through the storm. There were at least a dozen of them, their forms dark against the snow, Cheyenne warriors. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was it then, not a slow death by cold, but a swift end. He reached for the old rifle propped against the wall, his hand trembling not from fear, but from profound weakness. He would not die on his knees. The riders stopped a short distance from the cabin, forming a silent, intimidating crescent. One figure dismounted and began to walk toward the door. The figure was smaller than the others, moving with a grace and authority that defied the brutal weather. As the person drew closer, the wind whipped back the hood of their heavy, fur-lined cloak. Ezra's breath caught in his throat. The rifle slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor. It was Vivina. She was not the starving, desperate woman he had found by the creek. Her face was fuller, glowing with health and vitality. She was dressed in magnificent, decorated buckskins, adorned with intricate quillwork and beads that caught the faint light. Her hair was bound in two neat braids, and her expression was one of immense calm and power. She radiated an authority that was absolute. She was a queen. She stopped before his door and simply waited. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, Ezra forced his numb limbs to move. He unlatched the door and pulled it open, the wind tearing into the cabin's meager warmth. They stood facing each other, the blizzard raging around them. One of the warriors, an older man with a face like a weathered map, moved to her side. He looked at Ezra, then spoke to Vivina in their native tongue. Vivina responded, her voice clear and melodic, never taking her eyes off Ezra's face. Then she spoke to Ezra, her English hesitant but clear, learned in the intervening seasons. "You are Ezra," she said, less a question than a statement. He could only nod, his throat too tight for words. "I told my people of the man with quiet eyes who shared his only bread when the Great Spirit had turned his face from me," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "My father was a great chief. He died in the moon of the falling leaves. The council, they listened to my words. They chose my husband Kuruk to lead, but they listened to me. They honor the debt I carry." She gestured behind her, to the pack horses laden with supplies. "We have brought food, furs, firewood. You will not die in this place." Ezra was speechless, his mind struggling to comprehend the scene before him. The world had turned upside down. The woman he had saved from starvation had returned through an impossible storm, leading a band of warriors to save him in turn. But she was not finished. She took a step closer, her dark eyes filled with a fierce intensity. "My people have prospered. We have many horses. We have winter grounds in the sheltered valley, where the wind cannot kill. We have more than we need." She paused, letting her words sink in. "You shared all you had. Now, I offer you the same. Come with us. Half of our herds will be yours. You will have a lodge next to the chiefs. You will have a place of honor. You will never know hunger or cold again. I offer you half of all we have." The offer hung in the frigid air, impossibly vast. Half a kingdom laid at the feet of a broken man in a ruined cabin. He looked at her, at the powerful, respected leader she had become, and then he looked at his own chapped, empty hands. He thought of Callahan's cruel laughter and the world's casual brutality. And he thought of a simple act of kindness, a shared loaf of bread. A faint, unfamiliar sensation stirred within him. It was the ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time in years. He slowly shook his head, not in refusal but in wonder. "Vivina," he said, his voice raspy but steady. "I didn't do it for a reward." He fumbled inside his coat and pulled out the eagle feather. It was worn from his touch. He held it out to her. "I did it because you were a person in need. That's all." Vivina looked at the feather in his hand, then back at his face. A deep, profound understanding passed between them. Her regal facade softened, and he saw in her eyes the same woman he had met by the creek, the one who possessed a spirit that starvation could not quench. She nodded slowly. "I know," she said softly. "That is why you are worthy of the offer." He did not take half her kingdom, no man could, but he accepted their help. The Cheyenne warriors at her command filled his small cabin with firewood, unloaded sacks of grain and smoked meat, and covered his bed with thick, warm buffalo robes. They tended to his dying cow with a skill that shamed his own, bringing the animal back from the brink. They worked with quiet efficiency, turning his tomb of a cabin back into a place of life. Ezra did not become a chief or a wealthy man in the way Arthur Callahan would understand it. But as the winter thawed, he found he had received something far greater than land or horses. He had received a community. He was no longer an island of grief in a sea of grass. He learned to share meals at their winter camp in the sheltered valley, the sound of their language becoming familiar, the laughter of their children, a balm on his wounded soul. Vivina and her husband, Kuruk, became his friends, their bond forged not in a transaction, but in mutual respect and a shared understanding of hardship. He kept his homestead, but it was no longer a place of isolation. It became a bridge between two worlds. He learned from them, and they, in turn, respected the quiet man with the sad eyes who had shown kindness without asking for anything in return. The emptiness in his heart began to fill, not with a replacement for what he had lost, but with something new, a sense of belonging, a purpose. One day in late spring, as he rode with Kuruk, checking on the tribe's horse herds, he saw Arthur Callahan in the distance, his face a mask of disbelief as he watched Ezra ride alongside the Cheyenne chief. Ezra simply nodded in his direction, a silent acknowledgement of a battle won not with fences or force, but with a single loaf of bread. He had been offered a kingdom, and in a way, he had accepted. It was not a kingdom of land or power, but one of the human heart, built on the foundations of unexpected kindness, a place where a man could finally, after a long and brutal winter, feel at home.